Virgo, before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge you. Every comment, every share, every person who keeps coming back to this space, I feel it and I appreciate it more than words can fully capture. If you are new here, welcome. You found this at exactly the right moment. Now let's get into this reading because this one has been sitting with me and I need to get it out. Nobody expected that, least of all them. They had built a particular picture of you, comfortable in it, settled, operating from it as if it were established fact, the version of you that absorbs things quietly, that processes in private. That does not generally bring the full force of what it sees into the open in a way that cannot be ignored or dismissed or quietly buried under someone else's narrative. They miscalculated. And the moment you opened your mouth and said what you said, the moment the truth came out of you in that specific, direct, I am not softening. This form, something shifted in the room that you cannot unshift. Truth, once spoken clearly, changes the air permanently. I want to sit with what it took to get there because that moment did not come from nowhere. It came from accumulated observation, from the specific patient I am watching and I am noting quality of someone who has been paying close attention for longer than the people around them realized, who has been building a picture quietly without announcing the building of exactly what was happening and who was behind it and what the motivation was and what the pattern revealed about the person producing it. You saw clearly long before you said anything. The saying came later, after the picture was complete, after the specific internal threshold of someone who has gathered enough that the continued silence would be its own form of dishonesty. And when you spoke from that completed picture, not from emotion, not from reaction, from clarity. That is what made it land the way it landed. Let me describe the bitter wannabe energy because the title names it and it deserves its honest examination. There is a particular type of person who cannot tolerate someone else's authentic success. Not because they are simply envious. Envy is human and it passes. This is something more sustained, more organized. The specific, ongoing, requires continuous energy quality of someone who has decided that another person's thriving is a personal insult, who interprets your wins as losses for themselves, who cannot be genuinely happy for what you have built because what you have built keeps reflecting back to them something about their own trajectory that they cannot comfortably look at. Bitter and wannabe in the specific sense of wanting what you have, not just materially, not just in terms of visible success, but the intangible things, the quality of your character, the way people respond to you when you are simply being yourself, the ease with which you inhabit who you are, the specific, undeniable quality of someone who does not need to diminish others to feel their own worth. Those things cannot be copied or acquired or manufactured. And the person who wants them and cannot figure out how to develop them in themselves sometimes chooses a different strategy. They try to dismantle them in the person who has them through talk, through subtle undermining, through the specific, slightly calculated quality of someone who is managing their reputation in relation to yours by trying to bring your reputation to their level rather than by bringing themselves to yours. You saw it. You saw it from the beginning, or you saw it develop over time and you let it develop, watching until the picture was complete enough to be named clearly. That patience is not passivity. That is the specific, sophisticated quality of someone who understands that incomplete pictures produce incomplete responses, that the right moment to speak is the moment when what needs to be said has enough behind it to be undeniable. You waited for undeniable, and when undeniable arrived, you spoke. Tell me in the comments if you recognize this energy. If there has been someone in your life carrying this specific combination, the bitterness, the wanting what you have, the quiet campaign against you that thought it was more invisible than it was, whether you have had your own version of this moment, whether you said your truth and watched the room change, I want to know if this is reaching you. Now, what you actually said, I am not going to pretend to know the exact words, but I know their quality. I know them from the energy of this reading, from what is sitting in the field of this moment. What you said was specific, not a general expression of frustration, not an emotional outburst that could be dismissed as reactivity, something precise that named what was actually happening, that used the specific, accurate language of someone who had been observing carefully enough to describe not just the behavior, but the mechanism behind it, the why, the pattern, the thing underneath the surface that the surface was designed to hide. When you name the mechanism, the person operating it has nowhere to go because the mechanism depends on invisibility. It depends on the gap between what is actually happening and what can be officially acknowledged, on operating in that gap without the gap being closed. You close the gap with words, specific ones, and the closing of that gap is what they were not prepared for. I want to speak to what the room looked like in the aftermath. That silence I described at the beginning, that specific, nobody knows quite what to do quality of a moment where something has been said that everyone in the room understood and that nobody can pretend they did not understand. Some people in that room probably already knew what you knew, had sensed it, had their own private read on the situation that they had not yet voiced, and when you spoke, something in them recognized what you were naming as accurate, as the thing they had been quietly aware of without having the language or the courage or the specific, this is the right moment quality of timing to name it themselves. You named it for them. And the recognition in the room when that happens, the specific, collective, yes, that is what this has been quality of truth being spoken in the presence of people who knew it was true but had not heard it said, has its own particular energy. It is not comfortable for everyone. It is clarifying for almost everyone. Let me speak to something about the bitter wannabe specifically, about what happens internally for someone when the thing they were operating quietly is named clearly in public. The strategy collapses. The specific ongoing management of perception that the strategy required to the careful cultivation of a particular narrative about you, the subtle placements of doubt, the specific work of undermining done in the spaces where you were not present to represent yourself, all of that depended on the gap staying open, on the full picture not being available, on the people around them operating from incomplete information about what was actually happening. When you named it, the gap closed. And a strategy that depended on the gap has nowhere to operate without it. That is what you did. not with volume, with accuracy. I want to say something about the F, it energy, the title names, because that energy deserves its honest description. It is not recklessness. People confuse the two because they look similar from the outside. The person who has reached the point of saying what they have been holding back can look from a distance, like someone who simply stopped caring about consequences. That is not what this is. This is the specific, deliberate quality of someone who has done the calculation and arrived at the conclusion that the cost of continued silence exceeds the cost of speaking. Who has weighed what the speaking will produce against what the not speaking has already been producing? And who has understood clearly and without drama that the equation has shifted? The silence was costing more than the truth. That is what F, it actually means in its most honest form. Not abandon, release. The specific, intentional release of the obligation to protect someone who was not protecting you, to manage someone else's comfort at the expense of your own honesty, to maintain the fiction of a dynamic that was not what its surface suggested. You released that obligation, and the speaking that followed was not recklessness, it was freedom. I want to speak to something about what this moment reveals about your strength, not the obvious strength of having spoken, the less obvious strength of having waited until the moment was right. That restraint, the specific, patient, I will speak when the picture is complete quality of someone who does not lead with reaction is harder than speaking in the moment of activation. Much harder. Because the moment of activation has an energy to it that feels like it requires expression, that produces the specific physical quality of something needing to come out. And you contained it, not forever, but until the moment was right, until what needed to be said had everything behind it that it needed. That patience is not weakness. That is one of the most sophisticated forms of strength available. As we close, I want to give you one image, not of the moment itself, of you before it, in the specific quiet period of accumulation, watching, noting, building the picture with the patient, nothing escapes me quality of someone whose intelligence operates continuously even when nothing is being said about it. In that quiet, you already knew. You knew what was happening and who was behind it and what it meant and what the right moment would look like when it arrived. And when that moment came, you recognized it and you spoke with everything behind it. That is who you are, Virgo. Not the version they were trying to construct. Not the version they thought they understood. The version that saw clearly, that waited, that spoke at exactly the right moment with exactly the right precision. The version they did not see coming and still are not fully prepared for